Okay, hello and welcome to another one of our marine economy sessions. Today we're focusing on fishing and aquaculture. I'm Chris Kerr. For those of you who don't know me, I lead our marine economy group at HarperMcLeod, and today I'm delighted to be joined with three leading contributors in the world of fishing and aqua. We have Andy Reid, editor of Fishing News. We have Brian Isbister, the chief exec at the Shetland Fish Producers Organisation, and we also have Tavish Scott, who is the chief exec at Salmon Scotland. Welcome to each of you. Thank you for joining me today. I'm proposing that just to introduce our audience to each of you, I'm going to come to each of you and you can just explain a wee bit about the title or the organisation that you work for, and perhaps just the context in which you represent your members or your readers. So, Andy, if I may just come to you first, please.
Hi. Thanks very much for inviting me. For those of you who don't know Fishing News, we've been going since 1913, and we pride ourselves as the voice of the industry. We're primarily a print or journal for the commercial fishing industry, and we're sort of the main source of news and debate. One thing worth mentioning is we have a very diverse industry, from a little cove boat in Cornwall through to a huge pelagic vessel in Shetland. And clearly there's some very different views and priorities. But our readership is also growing, and it's growing in areas that people might not think. So we're selling more to, we've got 6 MPs in Westminster who are now subscribers, a lot of consultancies, NGOs, and that kind of audience. So we punch above our weight. I can sometimes get a call from the minister's office in Westminster saying we didn't like that op-ed last week, can we reply? So we're quite an important, we serve quite an important function for getting the industry view out to a wider audience.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So if we go to you in the almost far north, Brian, tell us about SFPO, please.
Yeah, the organisation that I represent, Chris, is an organisation that's been in function since 1982. Fish producer organisations were a design of the European Common Market arrangement to start with. So there were producer organisations in the UK from, well, pretty much from when Britain joined the Common Market back in the early 70s. By the early 1980s, it was pretty apparent to the fishermen here at that time that an organisation that could bring more focus to the needs and requirements of the industry here would make more sense. So our organisation was established back, as I say, in late 1982. Fish producer organisations have a clear remit. They're recognised under legislation, initially through the European legislation, and now, of course, that's been transferred into UK law since Brexit. Recognised for the function of organising on behalf of members, the producers, or the fishermen, in effect, our approach to the market and the organisation of our members' fishing activities. And from that point of view, the POs, producer organisations, and our one included, have a lot of responsibility in terms of how we address the management requirements for members' actions through the year, and our response to the market, I guess, and how we organise our production for the market. So it's been an interesting development from a Shetland point of view. Back in the early days, I guess we were part of a matrix then where there was no real implication in terms of fishing effort. The idea was pretty much to go out there and catch as much fish as you possibly could. The European approach at that time was to become more self-sufficient in terms of food supply. So part and parcel of that, we were during the early days able to focus on support and help to develop fleets, which we were very successful in doing here in Shetland in that early years. And we, at that time, were supporting a market system, processing sector here in Shetland that depended on high volumes of relatively low quality fish, generally small haddock and whiting. And as the pressure grew on the overall system, as it became apparent that the development of the fleet in the European context had probably gone a little bit too far, and quotas started tightening up, we found ourselves in a situation where our catching sector was actually developing. Converse situation in Shetland, of course, at the time was that the processing sector up here was actually failing, being that bit further away from the markets and in a position where, the processors here were no longer competitive. It was only a matter of time before something had to change. And one of the biggest challenges faced by our organisation in the context of all of that moving situation was the development of the market structures that we've got here today. In the demersal world, we've got a very successful market operation supplying essentially very high quality whitefish landed every 2 or 3 days into the upper end of the market structures, probably food service, as opposed to a dependency or a high dependency on retail and processing sector. And we were very lucky in Shetland. We share an excellent logistical chain with the aquaculture sector. So we're able to get our product, albeit we're a whole day away from UK mainland and a further day away from mainland Europe. We're able to get a fresh product very successfully into those markets. The producer organisation here represents both the demersal and pelagic sectors. So we've got a fleet of 22 at the moment, demersal vessels catching a wide range of whitefish species. And we have, in Shetland, we have 8 in total pelagic vessels, 7 of whom are in membership of this organisation. And we've helped over the years develop the pelagic market situation too. Back in the very early days of the producer organisation, pelagic fishermen in the United Kingdom were heavily dependent on a Klondike fishing operation, essentially hired in processing capacity from Eastern Europe, essentially. So Soviet states and Eastern European countries where deep sea fishing fleets were converted into processing units effectively. And they were buying the raw material at very, very cheap prices. And it really wasn't a business model we were comfortable with or saw a future in. So we were instrumental in Shetland here in developing the pelagic processor that we've got in the islands. Originally, that company was Shetland Catch, and then it morphed now into, together with Norwegian ownership, into being part of the wider Pelagia group based in Norway. Pelagia Shetland is a separate company to Pelagia, but operates under their remit, and very successfully. So, yeah, we've developed the market side, if you like, for our members over the years. And in order to do that, the only way we could achieve that was to ensure that we also had access to quota. And we've worked very hard over the years to try and maintain the quota share here within the islands. And we've been very lucky in the sense that with those two things working, we've retained a fleet here, while I appreciate that hasn't always been the case in other areas. So that's broadly the purpose of the organisation here, and we do all that, of course, in the context of whatever Mother Nature throws at us, and increasingly what the politicians chuck in our direction too, and that's not always easy.
Okay, Brian, thank you. That's helpful. And there's a whole load in there that I think we'll come back to. You've given me a couple of links to go to Tavish. One is the politicians. Some people will know Tavish as an ex-politician. But Tavish, I think you've now been in post at Salmon Scotland since about 2020. Have I got that right?
21, but yeah.
21. And the other link, which I'm sure you'll pick up on, Tavish, is just the way in which Brian indicated that the fishing and the aqua sectors need to work together in the context of Shetland, certainly. So over to you to tell us a bit about Salmon Scotland, please.
Yeah, Chris, lots of links, including the pelagia one that Brian mentioned last there, because pelagia are a big interest in the salmon sector in Scotland, as well as, of course, in Norway. And actually, one of the fascinating things I suspect Harper McLeod might want to have a look at is the way Norwegian business and politics looks at seafood, because it is somewhat way ahead of what happens, I think, in our country. But we could spend an hour on that easily. Yeah, look, Salmon Scotland, again, to Brian's point, we were a production, a PO back in the day, and then obviously the departure from the European Union meant we changed the status of the organisation, forced upon us by that change of events. So we decided to make the organisation what we now are, which is Salmon Scotland. So previously we were just the 6 production companies in Scotland, producing circa 180, 200,000 tons of product, exporting salmon to 50 countries around the world. And now we're not just those 6 production companies, but we're also 40 odd different businesses of every kind, from engineering, logistics, pharmaceuticals, to lots of others as well. And quite a few of those are obviously in Shetland. Shetland is 35 to 40% of the Scottish salmon production, as well as being huge in mussels as well. So I would argue Shetland is the centre of the seafood industry in Scottish terms, and certainly in economic terms. And why does that matter? Well, it does matter because, as Brian rightly said, we can have salmon harvested in Unst, the most northerly part of the UK, on a Monday morning, and it'll be on a dinner plate in Geneva by Wednesday night. And that's what we aim to do in terms of fresh product, and that's what the customer demands. And we're incredibly driven by those customer demands in terms of, the markets, not just in the UK but around the world as well. So we have to be very alive to that, and I suppose that's the segue, the making sure the regulatory place works for us, making sure politicians understand the seafood industry is really important, and making sure they don't impose policies upon the seafood industry that simply aren't appropriate is one of the challenges that we as a trade body put up with, just like Brian and colleagues in the fishing sector as well. So yeah, lots going on in that space. And I suppose the current one might be the biodiversity strategy that is being promoted by NatureScot, one of Scotland's, Scotland's chief advisor to government in terms of the natural environment. No one can be against, of course, biodiversity, but we also need to be alive to what does that mean for business, because organisations such as NatureScot don't have what does that mean for business at the top of their list to things to worry about. It's rather further down the list. So yeah, I suppose those are that's pretty high on my list of things at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Tavish. The danger with doing this type of discussion is it's such a broad spectrum, as everyone has now highlighted, that to pick out the parts that are kind of maybe the top of the list and worth talking about becomes quite difficult. I wonder if, just in terms of helping to do that, Andy, from a UK context, what's your sense of the health of the fishing industry? But also maybe it'd be quite interesting to hear your thoughts around a couple of the points that Brian and Tavish have mentioned, where there's quite this kind of internationalisation piece coming into play.
Yes. To answer first question about the health of the industry, we're certainly seeing winners and losers. Some of that's to do with climate change and changing waters. So that if you like, the southwest of England and the northeast of Scotland, the north of Scotland are the winners, and the losers are very much sort of the southern North Sea, eastern English Channel, where there's a real lack of fish. The cold water fish have gone, the warm water fish haven't arrived. I was up in Shetland a little over a year ago, and I live in the southeast coast, and the difference in the fish was breathtaking. You don't need to be a scientist to understand the health of the stocks in the north of Scotland. You just go to Shetland Market and see the size of the fish in the boxes, and it tells you everything. Whereas in the south, we've got an industry that's really struggling, and vessel owners here are effectively eating their capital. They're making an operating profit, but they can't reinvest in the future. And we've got a generation of skippers in their late 50s whose sons are not coming into the business, and they're going to cease to exist. To pick up on if you like, sort of the issues that are raised, and I think Tavis mentioned biodiversity and international markets. We're certainly seeing consolidation at the top end of the industry. So there's some very good profit being made both in the wire fish and the pelagic sector. And what's tending to happen is we're seeing consolidation happen quite quickly in both fleets. And that's going to continue. That's great news for the places where that's going to happen, and it's great news in terms of attracting entrants, because that's going to be a good working condition and good salaries. But for certain ports, it means the infrastructure is collapsing, and we're going to see more and more. We're going to see, I think, a few more ports lose their infrastructure entirely, and a few larger hubs to take over. In terms of our post box, if you like, which is a bellwether, if you like, for what's bothering people in the industry. Overwhelmingly, two issues in our emails and our complaints online. HPMAs, which has been a call and united a whole series of different fishing sectors that don't often have a lot in common. And Maritime Coast Guard Agency issues, and that is relating to the ML5, which is going to see a generation of older skippers leave. The issue of prosecution notices for not wearing life jackets, through to particularly the under 15 metre safety code. For larger vessels, the code's not at all contentious. For small boats, again, it's putting people out of business. And then international crewing. We're seeing several high-profile vessels that, for geographical reasons, need to fish inside 12 miles up for sale because of the crewing issue. And we saw yet again last week another raid, 60 officers from the police, border force, Maritime Coast Guard Agency, and Customs and Excise, raiding a small lobster business and basically tying him up this week. So those are the issues, I think. On HPMAs, we do have this coalition now, if you like, between the very largest and the very smallest vessels, with everybody scratching their head, saying, how did we come to this state of affairs?
Okay, and just before I move on from you then, Andy, do the points that you have raised there, does that then, in terms of you tracking what your readers are interested in as topics, that then ties into the points you've just made, that these would be the headlines that they're clicking into to read?
I think so. Yes, it's certainly what worries them. I would say that's a better way of putting it. The issues of concern, whereas a decade ago it would have been we've got no quota. Now, by and large, the stocks are doing well, things are recovering, and we've got species such as flapper skate or halibut, and no one fishes for them deliberately. They almost disappeared entirely due to overfishing in the 90s, and they're now creeping back, which is creating a problem for HPMAs, because what do you do when a species that was once at risk of extinction is suddenly doing well again?
Okay, I can't have you mention HPMAs twice and not go to Tavish. Salmon Scotland were quite vocal about HPMAs. Just give us a sense check, Tavish. I think I'm right in saying that HPMAs are now kind of in the long grass indefinitely. Is that current position?
Yeah, Chris, that is right. I mean, Andy makes a really good point. It was quite an astonishing set of circumstances that managed to unite the entire seafood sector from top to bottom, left and right. I don't know any other government initiative that backfired so spectacularly in terms of creating that sense of feeling and unjust imposition of a policy that wasn't appropriate. And remember, it wasn't just the seafood industry. All the 5 local authorities from Shetland down to Argyll all said the same thing, including Highland Council, the biggest geographic local authority in Europe, who also came out unanimously in support of the seafood sector. So it really was quite breathtaking.
Okay, I'm going to pick out another point that Andy made, and I'll maybe just mention this. You mentioned succession or consolidation, Andy, also is one of the big issues. I think we certainly have seen that a lot in particularly the aquaculture world, where you've got more and more overseas ownership, or the supply chain is consolidating more. Just from your sense, Brian, is succession an issue in the same way as Andy outlined? Is succession an issue for the skippers and the fleet in Shetland?
It is. It's an increasing challenge, I think, for the model we operate here. Traditionally, and it's a model we've tried and worked very hard to try and maintain, is the common ownership aspect. Vessels here tend to be owned and crewed by the same people. That model is quite unique, I believe, now, almost in a UK sense, other than in the small vessel fleet, where owners are actively at sea on board the vessel and operation that they manage. The consolidation aspect is very true. Andy touched on how that consolidation is working, and just by the nature of what we've had to do to retain our operation here, we've also seen some consolidation, but more so, I guess, in terms of quota ownership. We've had to purchase a lot of additional quota over the last 25 years or so to try and maintain the fishing effort we've got here. That involves capital input, and that also creates a value at the end of the day. So when vessel owners come to the stage of retirement or looking to move on, the value of the asset they leave behind is almost now impossible for the next generation to be able to move into. We've been very lucky in Shetland. We've had a number of boat changes in the last 2 or 3 years where we've maintained the model. We've seen young men come forward, and through various levels of support, we've maintained that model going forward. But I see that an increasingly difficult challenge, and that consolidation, meanwhile, continues. The big players in the industry continue to get bigger, and I guess the small man will get squeezed out. So, yes, that's one of the big challenges we face up here in Shetland to maintain the kind of model we've got going forward, where the values are now increasingly very, very high. Once upon a time, the main value was in the vessel, and your ambition was always to improve your vessel to be able to operate more effectively. Today, the cost of the vessel is secondary to the cost of quota and the license and wherewithal to be there. So very, very challenging for the next generation, and that's something that consciously we are aware of, and something we will try and be as effective as we can be in maintaining the opportunity for the next generation of fishermen here. As a producer organisation, we've invested a lot of money collectively in terms of quota ownership. So we protect members to a certain extent from the extremes of having to go out there and buy as much quota as what they might have done. And by default, we retain that quota again here for the next generation. But as I say, even at the levels that we see members left at, it's more and more difficult. So yeah, these are considerations.
Thanks, Brian. Just okay. So just continuing to try and pick out themes then in terms of quotas. What are the stock levels? What's the feedback on stock levels at the moment and lands?
Generally, the view of members is quite optimistic. We've seen over the last 20 odd years, we've certainly seen challenges. We actually, in membership of the Common Fisheries Policy, the combination of all the various mismanagements that took place leading up towards the end of the 1990s, there were clearly too many boats chasing too few fish. That was a reality. There was some really desperate measures that were applied at that time to remedy. We saw the horrible decommissioning schemes. We saw lots of vessels being taken out of the fleet, and we saw the incredibly difficult management decisions around quotas being reduced to very, very low levels. In the North Sea, the cod recovery plan and various different aspects. But generally, since that time, the trajectory in terms of quota availability has been, the health of the stocks has been generally an improving picture. Low TACs, and in many situations we believe that quotas have been pegged back too low because of the modern approach to fisheries management, which is a much more precautionary approach than previously was the case. We often find there's a mismatch between what quota levels are set at and the availability of stocks in the waters around here. Andy touched on the impacts of global warming. Now, that's something I'm no expert on at all, but we certainly appear to be seeing healthy seas around Shetland at the moment, and our vessels concentrating and fishing around our waters here. Availability of stocks generally here is very good across the wider range of species. And today vessels are landing probably a broader range of species than ever before. We don't, from year to year, see every single stock at optimum capacity, but you will see a very healthy picture at the moment. And fishermen are not concerned about that aspect. It's very much about the wider management issues that creates the problems.
Thanks, Brian. So then going across to the farmed sector then, Tavish, the climate change point, I think, has an impact on stock levels from time to time. What's the current thinking in the industry there around just mortality levels and or the impact of climate change in the temperature of waters?
Well, farmed salmon can live in temperatures between 7 8 degrees all the way up to 21 degrees. If you farm on East Coast Canada, you're farming with a huge variation in temperature, more than we have here in Scotland, whether it's down the west coast or up in Orkney and Shetland, where the water temperatures are by definition a degree or two colder. It's not so much the temperature; it's what's in the water that's much more of a challenge for the farm sector, and that again is wider than just salmon. That's all species of fish that are being farmed, and they'll be changing that as well because of warming temperatures with the way in which farms and different species are being utilized in, for example, the Mediterranean and now up the west coast of Europe, and that'll eventually reach, I think, the English Channel and that kind of thing. So lots is going to happen and change over the next 15, 20 years. I've no doubt about that. But your point, Chris, is a good one, that we are investing more and more money in both science and oceanographers and understanding current movements now than we did in the past, because what happens is that some of the organisms that do live in the marine environment and have not been a challenge in the past now are a challenge. So micro jellyfish, for example, they're the principal cause of mortality in fish farms, and we're trying to work out and learn more and more about them. The truth is, we don't have exact science on this. It's not adequately understood as yet. What we do know is that they move with the ocean current, and that's why it's been such a challenge down the west coast, not in Orkney and Shetland, but down the west coast of Scotland. So the short answer is the industry constantly innovates, constantly looks to invest in science, constantly seeks to understand what's happening in different parts of the world. Lots of international learnings, and here's the advantage of international ownership. I take the point that at times that can be seen as to be a negative in Scotland, but actually the advantage of international ownership is larger companies can invest more money in technical solutions to challenges of fish farm and sea pen farming, because they know what happens in Norway or East Coast Canada or in Chile or in other places. So that is our way around it, to innovate, to look at new techniques and to understand better and better what's happening, and therefore lots of work with scientific institutions, both Scottish universities but also universities across the rest of the UK and internationally, and for that reason, those connections are increasingly important, because we'll always be a science-based industry, very strongly around understanding fish husbandry in the marine environment will always be science-led, and that is all the more important when you have significantly greater challenges today than we have had in the past with algal blooms, with micro jellyfish, and with other organisms that frankly just pop up in the sea, and we've all got to deal with them. And that's the challenge in modern fish farming here, as it is frankly in Norway, Chile, Faroes, Iceland, and other localities as well.
And just what amazes me when we deal with the clients we have in this sector is just that point you make about innovation. So it's everything from net practices, whether it be washing or cleansing practices, through to the pharmaceuticals that you mentioned earlier, through to the processing on the harvesting vessels, etc., etc. And I think in turn, as you say, I think that is certainly one of the things that we see as being most active from a kind of corporate law point of view, which is that consolidation and commercial contract piece in that space.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. And here's the best example. We took two leading politicians out onto a treatment boat in West Loch Rogue in Harris a few weeks ago. These are two really intelligent human beings who understand politics, and understand the way in which the world operates. They were taken aback at the scale of that vessel and what went on board. And we took them up to the wheelhouse. Needless to say, a Norwegian in the wheelhouse, and Brian will know him because he used to live in the Tingwell Valley in Shetland. But I walked in there, he said, "Hello, Tavish, how are you doing today?" And I was, when did we last see each other? And I will not tell you what he said at that point, but the rather more important observation was that those vessels, just like Brian's industry, just the vessel advances, the technology on board now is way beyond the understanding of regulators, government, and politicians. And we have a constant job to do to tell and illustrate how industry is changing, because people still think, believe it or not, and I mean people, I mean regulators and people who have a responsibility over us, still think we feed fish by throwing pellets into a sea pen. That hasn't happened in 10 years. There's now AI technology used in terms of how we feed fish to maximize yield and to minimize environmental waste in that sense. In other words, literally no feed now falls right through a sea pen and ends up in the sea column. It all gets eaten because we use incredibly advanced technology, which my children may understand, but I'm really steadily struggling with this stuff because it's so clever to feed fish in the right way. And we took these two politicians out. They were genuinely and really interested in the kind of level of technology on board these vessels, and it would be no different from one of Brian's modern demersal vessels or the latest iteration of the pelagic vessels in Scottish and Shetland waters. That's the bit that we all need to spend more time explaining and taking these kind of people out, including, if I may say, legal practices and Harper McLeod senior partners, because your guys won't, unless they've been on one, understand that either. And I think our seafood industry, in the broadest sense, need to do an awful lot more of that, so that people then understand why we do what we do and how we bring product to market in the way in which we do, in the way in which we can.
I'm a big proponent of a site to visit, so always available. Andy, what about sticking with kind of tech and innovation? Has there been much in terms of newsworthiness coming through in the publication focused on tech and innovation or new practices?
Yeah, there has been. I mean, on the new vessel side, the concentration of effort in terms of improving crew conditions, improving catch quality at sea, and improving fuel consumption as well for diesel powered engines. That's where the innovation has been coming, as well as further concentration on minimizing bycatch, and all of those to some extent have worked. The fuel consumption figures for the latest generation of Scottish built demersal boats is really staggeringly good. It's half the consumption of vessels that were built 15-20 years ago for the same amount of towing power, and that's working very, very well for that sector now. And if you told these people 15-20 years ago the fuel consumption figures and the towing power, people wouldn't have believed you. So it's very, very good.
In terms of the product being used or the fuel being used, is there more and more chat about hydrogen, for example, coming in, or
there is. It's not quite there. We've run there's been a Vessels of the Future workshop, and some really good work done in Scotland by a group called Fisheries Innovation and Sustainability. The boats are not quite there yet. They've looked at LNG, they've looked at hydrogen, and they've looked at ammonia. For the demersal trawl fleet, those don't look like viable options yet. For the static gear fleet, battery power electricity is likely in the next 10 years to be cost effective, because there's no towing power involved. But that's going to need the stumbling block is regulators, because the whole licensing rules, the licensing transfer rules, the capacity, none of that work for an electric power boat. So, for instance, if you're an offshore potter working 100 miles out into the North Sea, you're going to go to sea on a diesel engine, and then you're going to switch to your electric engine when you get there. There's no way that the current licensing rules can cope with that second auxiliary engine. And there's going to need to be quite a lot of innovative thinking among the regulators about how this happens in that sector.
Brian, does that accord with what your members are saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Technology will get there, unquestionably, but that technology has to be driven by the wider maritime industry. And, you know, we will never be at the innovative cutting edge trying out that new technology, because the cost implications and the development requirements. So as we morph towards the solutions that, as the wider society, you know, we're going to need, then I believe, yeah, we'll be in a position to adopt those from a catching perspective. Andy is absolutely right. The current management regulations are far from effective, and would actually constrict any development that would be necessary. Vessels will have to become bigger. The alternative fuel sources are going to be more bulky, whatever that solution is going to be. Much more of the vessel capacity is going to be taken up with fuel cells, with alternative fuel, tankage, whatever that's going to be. So all of that has to be factored into a new way of looking and developing how the fleet infrastructure works. I don't think much of the existing fleet is suitable for retrofit, so we're looking at a massive rebuild program looking forward. So I would envisage the next generation of pelagic vessels will certainly morph more towards electric solutions. Already that's happening with deck machinery to an extent, in terms of propulsion, something to replace the power. It's going to happen in the merchant marine and in the military first, and then it'll come down to the size of vessels that we have. That's just natural progression. But this whole process is going to take a time. If you look at any of the world's leading airlines today, they're buying brand new airplanes by the hundreds, but they're still the same technology, by and large, what we were using 20 years ago. These aircraft will have a lifetime of 20, 30 years ahead of them before they in turn are replaced. And that's kind of how far away all these solutions are. There's no real quick fix. It's nothing going to happen instantly.
I suppose there's a couple of points that have come out then in two different themes around the succession, as well as if there is going to be a new vessel fleet required for building. I had pulled a copy of the Migration Advisory Committee report on occupation shortages, and the two roles that they said we have got a shortage in Scotland of was one, fishing boat masters, and two, roles within boat shipbuilding and repairs. So it almost kind of leads you to these are new skills or skills that we need more of to help with both of those themes.
Yeah.
Okay, we've kind of touched on it, I suppose, in a roundabout way, but Tavish, maybe just as a kind of final talking point, just thoughts around food security and supply, just more generally.
So this is where government has to be really realistic about arguments around food miles or around packaging, even around what's just been discussed around transportation mechanisms. Because if you impose through regulators, as it were, green standards on all of these things, you just push up costs and you make us less competitive against our international competitors. We get a fair bit of pressure, for example, on the fact that we still export fish, and I mean fish in the broader sense, in a particular form of packaging. Would we like the market to deliver a more sustainable packaging? Of course we would, but the market is kind of Brian's argument. The market will deliver that. It's not in this case a salmon production company's job to invent the new piece of packaging. What it is for the market to deliver that, and the production company will very happily take that on, as will fish salesmen, etc., etc. So these things will be led by innovation, and government should set criteria and aspiration in this place and let the market deliver. But that underlines the importance of feeding our own population. To be brutally honest, Britain isn't that good at eating fish, if I may be so bold. I mean, you've had a body called sea fish that's existed an awful long time, but every time I look at the consumption trends, they're still going the wrong way. I spend a fair bit of time in Spain. The Spanish love fish, and they love salmon. Frankly, far too much of it's Norwegian compared to Scottish, but that's one of my bugbears in life and one of my challenges. But good on them. For the Norwegians are excellent in this market, as they are in every market around the world, in making sure their products available. But there's an educational job there at a local level. But we've also got to be kind of realistic about it. If you drive an argument in terms of health standards, and even just the debate in our country about what constitutes, as it were, healthy food, there are very well-funded ENGOs and other campaign groups who would have us all eating plants. I'm a pretty firm believer in a balanced diet, and many good friends are vegetarian or even vegan. But at the same time, many people still like that balanced diet, and I don't think we're doing a great job at even at school level making sure that the next generation. So our responsibility is to make sure that kids love seafood and at least have a chance to sample that, if that's something that maybe they don't get at home at the moment. But we need procurement policies in local government that allows school cooks and people who do those kind of things to source local products. And in our case in Shetland, that would be lots and lots of fish and other products from the sea. And that would be different in different parts of the UK. So there's lots of elements that I think need to join up on that. But the big bit at the top is, if now we've left the European Union, you remember the argument that was used by those who said we should leave the European Union would be that food would be cheaper. Well, that's I understand the politics of that argument, particularly during a cost of living crisis that our country is currently going through. But it isn't a great message if you're a salmon producer, a fish salesman, or a beef producer, or running a pig farm in some part of England, because all that says is government says you should bring your costs down. Well, how do you do that? Then you have to start thinking carefully about your animal husbandry standards. So there are consequences of that kind of policy approach, which I don't think politicians give any credence to whatsoever. So we need a reset on that one. And maybe the fact we are having a cost of living crisis will allow some sensible people to get a grip of that issue and say that actually good local food, either caught from the sea or produced in the sea or grown on land, is going to be every bit as important as the new techniques of vertical farming, where we're seeing, I'm sure Harper McLeod have got corporate clients in this space, but where we're seeing vegetables grown in new kinds of ways, which we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago. I think all that's good, but I think it's all part of a balanced approach to where our food comes from and then how we make sure people get that.
Thanks, Tavish. Okay, I said I wouldn't keep you longer than about 30 minutes, so I'm going to ask you for final thoughts. Anything that we've not touched upon that you think our audience would like to hear about, or just as some final thoughts, Andy?
Not much to add, although I would say one thing to add on that food security issue is that we're seeing British fishermen regularly, possibly putting fish into a market in the UK against fish that's been landed with forced labour, fishing to very different environmental and safety rules, and it's fundamentally unfair. I take completely Tavish's point that fish is cheaper. But it comes at a cost to the environment, and it comes at a cost to humans elsewhere, and we're merely we're risking over-regulating our own fleet, who can't compete on price. And we're going to see a growing awareness about this and a growing political move to create a level playing field. Certainly the politicians I'm talking to, it's becoming more and more apparent that they're looking at some kind of environmental social audit for fish that comes into the UK, which I think can only be a good thing.
And just on that point specifically, that you mentioned in your opening remarks, Andy, that you are seeing that more of your readership and the people you're talking to, the spread of them is now including more NGOs and MPs and MSPs. Do you think that's because they are becoming better educated as to the things they need to be thinking about in this sector?
I think so. I mean, an element of it is NGOs spying on the fishing industry, if you like. They're reading fishing news because they want to find out what the enemy's up to. Mm-hmm. And there are a group of NGOs that, for all the rhetoric, want to do nothing other than close down the fishing industry. There's a different group who might want to see a more eco-friendly version of fishing out there. But there is a distinction between the two. I think it is. It's becoming sort of those discussions are becoming better informed, and we're finding we had I can name him. He won't mind. We had one NGO we awarded Idiot of the Week to a few months ago. He was on Farming Today talking absolute arrant nonsense about crabs, and he actually sent us a letter subscribing to Fishing News, so he's no longer so ignorant, which I was quite pleased about. And I haven't named him. In fact, I won't. But if you read Fishing News, you'll pick up who it was.
We're happy with that. Okay, Brian, final thoughts? Anything we've missed of note?
We've covered quite a lot. I mean, there's so much more, Chris. It'd be very difficult to go into detail on a different subject matter. I think, from my perspective, the thing I find probably most difficult in terms of where we're at now in 2023 is just the high level of political interference, if you like, that's just not meaningful anymore. There isn't that interface. I think Tavish, in some of his contributions earlier, highlighted how difficult it is to get across the complexity and the reality of our industry to politicians that don't engage any more effectively. There's a lot of issues around devolved governance that I could spend a lot of time highlighting. Frustrations from my point of view. But I would like to see more connect again between government and industry. And yes, there's a question rightfully to be asked around sustainability and the environment and all the various aspects that these green NGOs in particular highlight. But Andy is absolutely right. There's a cohort in there that have a mission to disrupt and actually put an end to fish catching. And that's kind of the difficult environment we operate in today. And that's probably as big a challenge as anything else we face at the moment, because that cuts across every aspect, whether it's confidence from lenders, confidence from managers and whoever else, and ultimately that affects the guys going to sea. Looking at it from our community here in Shetland, the maritime economy is still the real prospect for us. That's where our future lies, and we're going to have to continue working very hard to maintain and keep that.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Tavish, final thoughts?
Yeah, just let me just do the one point at the end, which kind of links to Brian and Andy's contributions. I'm still really optimistic about seafood, because if you don't need to watch too many David Attenborough series to realize that we will not be cutting the Amazon rainforest down anymore. So, as it were, cheap beef production out of Argentina or Brazil isn't the future, and the world has said no to that. And therefore, if we want to feed an ever-growing worldwide population, and it is ever-growing, and you've got 600 million hungry people in Africa that at some stage will move in the way in which other continents have into having more money and more disposable income, then seafood is the future. There's no two ways about it. You said, Chris, at the start, it's the blue economy, or you can entitle it any way you like. But the blue economy is the future, and therefore we'll all be in a place where we just need to win these arguments that Andy and Brian have just spoken to about NGOs and government and regulation and all those kind of aspects to keep the big picture right up there. And that does win with politicians. And it wins crucially, I think, with the younger generation who get the ethical dimension to producing food from the sea in a sustainable fashion that is a better way forward than, frankly, other alternatives. And I think that's what makes me optimistic about my sector, in whether it's here in Scotland or in Shetland, or frankly in Canada or in other places, compared to some others. So I think broadly we can be very positive about the future. But yeah, we've sure got some short-term stuff to deal with in all of our different places of work.
Thank you, Taj. That's a really useful way to sum up, I think, what we've discussed. I think with the complexity, hopefully there is still lots of opportunity and reasons for optimism. Okay, thank you to each of my contributors. I thought that was a fascinating discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I did. In terms of the rest of the week, we're going to be talking to an individual leading on renewable energy with the Deep Wind Cluster Group. We're talking about economic regeneration of one of the ports in Orkney, and we're also releasing a report on the Green Free Ports, which are the two new trading zones in Scotland. In terms of today's content, at the same time, we're going to be releasing a video tour of one of the pelagic trawlers that Brian mentioned earlier. It's based in Lerwick. So we're going to be seeing around the research with the skipper, Nigel Tulloch, and that's worth watching as well. Meantime, and finally, and just repeating myself, thank you to Andy Reid, thank you to Brian Isbister, and thank you to Tavish Scott. That was excellent. And we'll look forward to hearing more as the days pass.